It's California in the late 1960s, and Charles Manson, fresh out of prison and before his notorious murder rampage, attracts teenagers to join his hippie commune.
The whole thing is almost like this date with destiny.
Where it was like, Charlie, Diana's here. And I was just like flabbergasted. The girls totally enfolded me as a sister, and they were a family.
He started really fascinating me and seemed just to know me through and through.
Manson descends into madness and his belief in an apocalyptic vision.
Can you see the blood, on my hands? It's because I died for you.
They are believing that he is God, therefore he is infallible.
And he even sends his minions in a crusade to kill for him.
He told them to just commit horrible murders and to make it as horrible as possible. And then, he left. He let them do it. California was really a hotbed of the hippie movement. Teenagers sought a better life. The summer of 1969 was dubbed the Summer of Love. But on August 9th and August 10th, the feeling of that summer was changed forever.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Ms. Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Ms. Tate, who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant. The bodies had been dead about 12 hours. They were discovered this morning by a maid who ran screaming to neighbors. One officer summed up the murders when he said, "In all my years, I have never seen anything like this before." 24 hours later, another gruesome murder scene is discovered nearby. 15 miles away in the Silver Lake section of Los Angeles, market owner Leo LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were found by their children stabbed and mutilated. 5 months later, the public would get their first glimpse of the world's most notorious cult leader, 33-year-old Charles Manson, and the bizarre group of men and women calling themselves the Manson Family.
Hi, how are you?
Good. You happy with your course?
Yeah.
Are you happy with it? Am I happy with your court? I wouldn't accept it.
And I remember watching some footage taken after the arrests and of the Manson family, and it was chilling. These people believed Charles Manson was God.
My name is Diane Lake, and I was the youngest member of the Manson family, and I lived with him for 2 years.
Like so many others during the 60s, Diane Lake's parents dropped out to seek a different life and moved their family to the Hog Farm, one of America's oldest hippie communes in Los Angeles.
My father was the one that introduced me to LSD. I remember having an experience on that trip where I felt like a big cable had been cut between me and my parents.
Even though she's just 13 years old, Diane is granted permission to leave the farm and explore the thriving hippie scene on her own.
The whole thing is almost like this date with destiny, because Black Bus Charlie, as he was called at the time, had gone to the hog farm. Diane's mother gave a photograph of Diane to Charlie and the girls, as they were called, and said, "If you see our daughter, tell her we'd love to see her again."
A few months later, Diane bumps into the group at a party in Los Angeles.
It was like, Charlie, Diana's here. And I was just like flabbergasted. How do you know me? But, Charlie came over and they were all gushing. "Oh, we're so glad you're here. We were looking for you." And it just felt really magical. The girls totally enfolded me as, you know, a sister, and they were a family. Charlie took me, you know, by the hand and led me down that evening, made love to me like I'd never been made love to before. It was very special, and I think that that experience was like a drug.
And through this sex ritual, Diane Lake became a member of the Manson family. She was only 14 years old.
Charles Manson was incarcerated from the time he was a child until he was in his 30s. And when he walked out of prison, you know, during the Summer of Love, and he came out into that counterculture hippie world, he realized that those naive young people were not in any way equipped or prepared to deal with him. And so he found women, vulnerable young women, teenagers really, a lot of them, very young.
He was obviously, from many accounts, a very abused and abandoned young boy. His mother basically sent him to Boys Town so that she could be with another man. When he, as a little boy, was expecting that when she got out of jail, because she was a prostitute, that she was gonna get her son and they were gonna live together happily. So he had a lot of ego wounds.
Here was this guy, he was like a well-oiled manipulation machine. And he had run his little con games and studied manipulation.
The family wanted me to stay with them, and they were planning a trip to New Mexico. And it was like I had to make a decision. I made the decision to go with Charlie.
Diane Lake joins Manson and his group of followers into a journey that will become a roller coaster ride. During the 1969 Summer of Love, Charles Manson is released from prison and seizes an opportunity to take advantage of the impressionable hippie community in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco. He establishes himself as a charismatic guru and starts a cult called by some as the Family.
My name is Catherine Scher. I was known in the 60s as Gypsy. Well, the first time I saw Charlie, he looked like an old scruffy cowboy. While we were driving, I realized that he wasn't. He was looking in the rearview mirror and asking me some pretty poignant questions. I didn't know that at the time that it was Charles Manson. This is not your typical what you think of as a cult, because it started out just a lot of people were living in communes and whatever. Charlie wasn't acting like a cult leader. He was acting like our best friend and cared about us and everything.
A cult wants someone who is at a turning point in life where there's something that's not satisfying them, because then they're seeking. It's a perfect match.
Charles Manson was incredibly charming, very smooth talker, charismatic. He was a little man, and I think that he grew up in prison, and it must have been very difficult for him. I think that may have scarred him for life, and he certainly was a survivor. But he had very little empathy for anyone. He always blamed everyone else for what happened. He never took responsibility for anything, and he scapegoated his girls. He scapegoated his followers. He wanted to blame them for everything. Very similar to other cult leaders that I have met. They're never wrong, they're always right.
Charlie had his back to us, and he was wearing this robe, and there was a young man lying prostrate at his feet, thanking him for freeing him and crying. And that was Charlie. And he was saying, "That's all right, brother, just give it all to me. And just be free of all that." He started really fascinating me.
Newcomers are easily seduced by the deep affection exhibited between the Manson family members.
I had instant sisters, only child, adopted. I had the, orphan syndrome where I'm constantly trying to make family out of people. And there it was, the family I had been looking for.
Lynette Fromm and I had a closer connection with her than any of the other girls. And Mary Bruner was kind of like our mother figure. Patty Krenwinkel was like the Mother Earth. She was just a very natural, nurturing kind of person. Susan Atkins was a little bit more worldly. So she had more street smarts.
The Manson family loads into an old school bus and takes off on a cross-country adventure.
When we were traveling, it was basically just, traveling from friend to friend. And usually Charlie had somebody else driving. And he would play the guitar and we would sit around in a circle and sing, smoke marijuana, take LSD, have sex.
Sex is a fundamental way for the family to bond, and it becomes one of their most sacred rituals.
We'd be in a circle and he'd give out, the LSD like a sacrament. And then he would take off, maybe his shirt, and he'd help the next person take off their shirt. And then instruct that person to help the next person take off their shirt. And it was just, kind of a round robin, and it just would evolve into like a group sex. But he definitely orchestrated.
Wanted them to be very experienced in all forms of lovemaking. Little did they know, or little did Diane know, that would come in handy for him later on as he was using them as a physical asset, like money.
Charlie encouraged us to bring other people into the fold, but he wanted them to be able to offer something to the family, and they had to be, good looking, have money.
He gave them names. He told them what to do. He orchestrated all the sex sessions. He told them when they could take drugs, when they could not take drugs. He told them when they would have to sit and listen to him pontificate upon hours.
March 1968. The family moves on to Spawn's Movie Ranch, an Old West town built as a movie location and horseback riding stable. The 55-acre ranch is run by a blind 80-year-old cowboy named George Spahn.
Charlie had us taking care of George, cleaning his house, servicing his sexual needs, and just being there, being like a companion. So George loved that.
While they were there, it was like a magical time. They would dress up, there were horses, they worked in the stables, they helped plan some of the horse tours. It was a time when they were comfortable with each other. This time was not a time of darkness.
Manson's free-loving, drug-fueled community had grown to about 30 people, including Charles Watson, who they called Tex.
It's amazing because Tex Watson was the All-American. He was voted most likely to succeed. He was a football player. And he became one of the most dedicated, devoted followers of Charles Manson.
Manson begins to speak about himself as being man's son, the son of man, and shares a personal spiritual experience with the group.
He'd have this crucifixion experience on acid with Mary there, and then he would reenact that. Can you see the blood, on my hands? It's because I died for you. You could just imagine. I remember seeing like blood coming from his hands, but I think it was just the power of suggestion, and and he was really believing it. I think he really did.
He would give them the hallucinogenic drugs, and while they were under the influence and very suggestible, he would guide their trip and he would manipulate their minds.
Music would play an important role in the sordid tale of the Manson family.
And he thought, I'm a pretty good songwriter, I'm a poet, I can sing, I can strum my guitar, I can be a star.
Pretty girl, pretty girl, cease to exist, just come and say you love me.
Manson saw an opportunity. with Dennis Wilson, drummer for the Beach Boys.
A couple of the girls were hitchhiking and Dennis Wilson picked them up. And so that's how they introduced Dennis Wilson to Charles Manson. I think Dennis was very much enthralled or captured by Charlie's charisma.
Another appeal to Dennis was the girls, because Manson offered him the girls and offered him good drugs. Having someone like Dennis Wilson believe in Manson and his music was a major coup. It was opening doors to other people who could help him and make things happen. And it was also confirming to the acolytes that he's really something. It was a very exciting time for them.
Manson wants his message spread through his music and pressures Dennis Wilson to get him a record deal.
So Dennis introduced him to Terry Melcher. And Terry Melcher, of course, is the son of Doris Day. He was a very well-known record producer at the time.
And he tried to persuade them with his girls, but ultimately he didn't get what he wanted. And he was angry about it. And in the end, they just kind of said, "Goodbye, Charlie," and they moved on. And so he became very angry.
Manson goes over to Melcher's house on Cielo Drive to complain, unaware that he's moved out, and shows up in the middle of a party given by one of the new residents, Sharon Tate.
Charles Manson was just a very angry, angry man who wanted to get revenge on all the people that didn't let him be the star that he thought he should be.
You are his enemy now. And he's going to go into fight and flight mode because now he perceives you as a threat.
By the spring of 1969, the Manson family had been living together at Spahn Ranch happily for the most part. But after being rejected by record producer Terry Melcher, things began to take a dark turn.
They're against me now. It was really unfortunately not uncommon language for a messianic cult leader, but he was really becoming angry.
Diane had a hard time following Manson's new strict doctrine and constant lectures.
She was a teenager, and some of it was like, "You already said that, Charlie. I don't want to listen to this. I want to go party, or let's go have sex or do drugs or something."
The first person I saw abused was Diane by Charlie. He slapped her in front of me, and I faced him with it. I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "You stay out of it." She was calling for it.
Catherine also finds herself at the receiving end of Manson's rage.
He jumped on me and punched me in the face, in the solar plexus. He told me to stand up. I did, and he started strangling me. And he asked me if I was ready to die.
He would often ask his followers, "Would you die for me?" He is filling their heads with this idea that you need to be willing to kill or be killed.
In November 1968, the Beatles released their iconic White Album.
One of the songs was Helter Skelter. He interpreted those lyrics as totally relevant to his idea of reality, and that there would be this white-black race war and this apocalypse.
He said he learned about that by being accepted by blacks in prison, and they'd tell him that they were going to have this revolution, and they've had enough, and they were going to just take over. So what we need to do is find a place and wait till it's all over.
Civil and racial tensions in Los Angeles in the late 60s also begin to play into Manson's new brand of apocalyptic thinking.
We didn't have a television, and he was our news. He saw Watts burning, and so in his mind, that meant it's getting close. It's going to happen pretty soon.
July 1st, 1969, The dominoes begin to fall when Tex Watson gets into a bad dope deal with a black man named Bernard Lotsa Papa Crow, and Manson decides to take business into his own hands.
He went to save the day and ended up shooting Bernard Crow in the stomach and thought he killed him. Bernard Crow played dead.
The next day, Manson watches in the news that a member of the Black Panthers got killed. Manson didn't know it at the time, but Crow wasn't a Black Panther, and he wasn't dead.
He put two and two together, and he thought he had just killed a black man. He thought he must be a Black Panther, because he didn't know Bernard Crow, who wasn't a Black Panther, by the way. In his mind, we had to get off that ranch because the Black Panthers knew where we lived, and we had killed one of them.
Even though Bernard Crow recovers from his injuries and never seeks revenge, Charlie's paranoia worsens every day.
Darkness started to happen when Charles Manson was beginning to feel this threat. He was, in my opinion, descending into delusion.
Charlie was convinced that this race war was really going to come down and happen, and that we had been introduced to the desert as a place to get away.
He was able to find a Hopi legend that said there is a bottomless pit. It leads to prehistoric ocean under the ground, and that's where we will hide out. And he said, and we won't age. We're going to be the same age as when we go in, and the race war is going to happen, and the black people are going to win, except they're not going to know how to handle the leadership because they've never been free. And so we're going to come out and take over, and we are going to run the world.
Manson discovers a remote property in Death Valley called Barker Ranch and decides to move the family there.
Barker Ranch it's quite the experience to get there. It's quite a hour's drive, and then along the Panamint Range. Then once you're there, once you're at Barker Ranch, there's nothing for like miles.
I remember, you know, it was a lot prettier and more alive back then. There were fun times. I remember, like decorating the place with bottles and rocks and, making paths. And we were planting, I remember planting a garden in some of these, fenced off areas. And I remember also wanting to commit suicide here. I was just really scared. It was night. I felt alone and scared and trapped, and I was going to go in that little building behind me, that brown building that still exists. It was like a workshop, and smack myself in the head with a hammer. And I feel like God stayed my hand. It was a way out, a way out of that dilemma. These were the front stairs going up to the ranch. There was a covered patio all on these two sides of the house. Two little bunk houses there. And this would have been the doorway to the kitchen.
This is where cults become dangerous. He has now isolated all of his followers. He has a hierarchy. He has made certain people feel more special than others. He lets them into the inner circle and the secrets of what he's planning. He also is telling them his truth is the only truth. He's telling them that he is God. They are believing that he is God. Therefore, he is infallible.
And believing in Manson will soon have deadly consequences for some of his followers. at the age of 32. In order to survive the system after spending more than half his life imprisoned, Charles Manson has learned how to be a master manipulator. When he finds freedom, he uses this persuasion skill to convert young disenfranchised youngsters to join his hippie commune. But toward the summer of '69, Manson becomes more paranoid and delusional, convincing his followers of an impending race war and that following him to the desert is their only salvation. Through a series of exercises, he trains them on how to survive the worst to come.
At first it was an exercise, and then it turned into burglaries. But they had a cute little name, Creepy Crawlies. It was kind of fun because we changed the tape, the chairs around, put them on top of the table, sat behind a couch very quietly while people watched television, and they never knew that they were in the house.
Manson also invites the motorcycle club, the Straight Satans, to help protect his ranch in exchange for sexual services and free drugs.
The next domino was when the motorcycle club decided they were going to have a 10-year reunion, and they wanted something different to do.
Charlie's drug-dealing friend Bobby Beausoleil knows a mescaline supplier named Gary Hinman. On Charlie's behalf, Bobby agrees to be a middleman, and the bikers give him $1,000 to pay Hinman for the drugs.
With masculine, that if you don't have a clean system, you'll get sick before you get high. But they were sure that they were poisoned and gotten sick and it was bad drugs, and they wanted their money back.
Manson sent Mary Bruner, Susan Atkins, and Bobby Beausoleil to persuade Gary Hinman to give them money.
Gary refuses, and things quickly spiral out of control. They call Manson, who decides to take matters into his own hands.
Charlie had a sword from one of the motorcycle guys, and as soon as Gary Hinman opened the door and Charlie just slashed his face without asking any questions, Bobby said, "What did you do that for? I had it all settled." And Charlie said, "I'm just teaching you to be a man."
And then he left because Manson didn't want to get his hands dirty, and he said, "Okay, get the money from him. You know what to do."
2 days later, Hinman is found dead in his apartment, smothered with a pillow and stabbed by Bobby Beausoleil and Manson follower Susan Atkins. Following Manson's directions about pinning blame on the Black Panthers, before they leave, Atkins scrawls on the wall the words "political piggy" in Hinman's blood.
They thought they covered themselves and that people were going to think that the Black Panthers did it. And so nobody would even draw attention to what they were doing.
August 6th, 1969, a week after Gary's body is discovered, police pull Bobby over. He's driving Gary Hinman's car. Police find a bloody knife hidden in the tire well, and Beausoleil is arrested for Hinman's murder.
I think after Bobby was arrested, Charlie had a psychotic break. He went into total psychotic self-preservation.
Manson is convinced that if he can shift murder suspicions from Bobby Beausoleil to the Black Panthers, he can get his friend out of jail and also ignite the self-prophesized race war that he's named Helter Skelter after the Beatles song. On the night of August 8th, 1969, Manson sends 4 family members, Linda Kasabian, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Tex Watson, to the house on Cielo Drive that he had visited earlier that year while looking for record producer Terry Melcher.
He told them to just commit horrible murders and to make sure that it was something that could be attributed to the Black Panthers and to make it as horrible as possible. And then, he left.
The 4 family members approach the property and are surprised by the headlights of a car coming toward them down the driveway. Tex Watson orders the women to hide in the bushes while he halts the vehicle. The driver is Stephen Parent, a friend of the house's caretaker William Garrettson. After slashing Parent's wrist with a knife, Tex fires 4 bullets, killing the man instantly.
Then they went up to the house and they viciously murdered Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, Wojciech Frykowski, who was a friend of Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate's husband, and Abigail Folger, who was the heiress to the Folger coffee dynasty, and then Jay Sebring, who was a good friend of Sharon Tate.
In an attempt to connect this crime with Hinman's murder, the group writes the word pig on the front door with Tate's blood before leaving the scene. The following morning, America wakes up in horror when watching the news.
What was reported in all of the media was how vicious this attack was, because it was just this gratuitous, horrible, vicious, animalistic, savage crime.
Manson uses the news of the killings to help convince the rest of his followers that it must have been committed by members of the Black Panthers and that the race war he'd been prophesizing had begun.
So he took out the headlines and told us it's all started. So that's the first time I heard about anything.
August 10th, 1969. Manson decides to take his race war prophecy to the next level. A day after the brutal killings on Cielo Drive, he drives the same group, along with family member Leslie Van Houten and a newly friended ranch hand Steve Clem Krogan, to the home of supermarket owner Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary.
So he takes them all to this home, and he goes into the home and he shows them how to tie them up. He uses, I believe, a leather from his clothing, and they cover their faces and they wrap lamp cords around them, and then he leaves.
Manson, Steve, and Linda head back to the ranch, leaving the others with the terrified LaBianca couple.
It was Patricia Krenwinkel and Tex Watson who were doing the stabbing. Eventually, Tex said to Leslie, "Do something."
Leslie takes the knife from Tex and ferociously attacks and kills Rosemary. The police investigation later reveals that Rosemary is stabbed 47 times. Using the victim's blood, Krenwinkel writes "Rise," "Death to Pigs," and a misspelled "Helter Skelter" on a wall, while Tex Watson carves the word "War" on Lino LaBianca's stomach. DA office prosecutors would say later that the only reason for the murders is that the LaBiancas were white and rich.
And they murdered them in some kind of effort, they thought, to bring on this helter-skelter, this prediction of doomsday. But in reality, it was just about Charlie Manson getting even for all the people he felt had not given him his due. And it was, again, this kind of malignant, narcissistic rage.
5 days later, the police raid the Spawn movie ranch, yet this operation would be unrelated to the Tate and LaBianca murders.
So they just arrested people for maybe dune buggies, stolen cars and dune buggies, and then they let everybody out.
But the raid doesn't stop the family's murderous spree. The next victim is a 35-year-old stuntman who hangs out frequently at the ranch named Donald Shea, nicknamed Shorty.
Charlie was sure that Shorty Shea had brought it on because he said that Shorty Shea wanted to be manager of the ranch.
On August the 25th, Tex, Clem, and a friend of Manson named Bruce Davis viciously murder Shea. 8 years later, police find his skeletal remains buried at the ranch. Late in the summer of 1969, the walls of Charles Manson's peaceful California hippie commune are beginning to crumble. Charlie's rejection by the outside world has changed him, and in his anger, he's manipulated some of his followers to commit horrible murders in Los Angeles. While he attempts to shift the blame for those murders into his vision of a race war, he and his family retreat into the California desert.
The worst thing to happen is for a cult leader to have followers who have nothing to do, because they'll lose the programming. So by keeping them busy and occupied, he's keeping them under his spell.
Yet on October 10th and 12th, Barker Ranch would be raided by the Eno County Sheriff's Department, but like in the previous raid at Spawn's Ranch that were based on reports of stolen vehicles, these raids would also not be related to the brutal murders. The family members who committed them have so far been able to keep their secret.
Most people that lived there didn't know that some of the people had been the perpetrators. I was highly suspicious by that time for some different reasons, and I thought the raid was about that. I was surprised when it wasn't. The second raid, the very last raid, is when we all ran to the desert, and then Charlie decided to burn up an earth mover. For people that are hiding, I mean, that's the crazy thing to do. And then we were chased around by the local sheriff's deputies.
I think I had just finished washing my hair, so I had just wrapped it in a towel, and then I don't know if they knocked at the door or they just I think they just blew it open and said, you're under arrest. Well, he was right here in the kitchen, but he disappeared, and come with me, I'll show you the little bathroom round this corner. He ducked into here, and where that little triangle is in there, that area was where the cupboard was. He had to have been like this, with the door closed, because there would have been a pipe. Would have been a pipe there, and the sink. So he was like tucked in here when they found him. He said something silly like, "Oh, hi, I'm Charlie Manson," or something like that.
Charles Manson and many members of his family are arrested, and this time held for trial for vandalism and car theft.
Are you all happy with your courts?
Yeah.
Are you happy with them?
Yet there were still some members who managed to escape. While walking on Venice Beach, two of them meet Aesop, the nickname of a 24-year-old singer and actor named Mark Ross.
I told them that I was living in Venice and I had a house and I was close to the beach. And, if they were down that way, they were welcome to stop by and, hang out. And either that night or the next night, 4 girls showed up and 3 guys. They stayed for a while. I mean, it was, a month or so.
Lynette Squeaky Frome assumes the leadership and tries to reunite the remaining family while Manson is in prison. Then one day, things take an abrupt turn.
What happened was fate intervened. Susan Atkins had been arrested, and she was now implicated in the Gary Hinman murder.
While in custody, Atkins let slip out that she was involved in the Tate LaBianca murders.
Susan started telling her cellmates because she was sure that he was a messiah and that this was all real, and she was kind of like bragging about it to her cellmates and trying to get them on board.
Atkins' cellmates tell authorities about her confession, and that leads them to Charles Manson and an indictment in the case.
Charles Manson so completely controlled his followers that they became weaponized, and that he used them as a weapon to murder people. And so therefore, even though he wasn't at the scene of the crime, he was responsible for the murders.
Atkins' admission also leads to the arrest of Patricia Krenwinkel, one of the family members who is staying at Mark Ross's house.
When I saw on television the talk about Manson and the girls that were on the ranch and stuff, and I looked at the girls and I said, God, that's some of those girls are the girls that were living with me down in Venice. I mean, and they were cool. I mean, we got along great, and they weren't murderers, for goodness sakes.
Aesop would find this entire case to be a great subject for a documentary. Following the arrests, he moves up to Spawn Ranch and follows the 3 members of the Manson family during one of the most sensational media trials in California history.
After 194 days of testimony and 43 hours of jury deliberation, the longest and most bizarre case in California history, was brought to a first phase close when the jury of 12 delivered verdicts of guilty on 27 counts of first-degree murder against Charles Manson and 3 members of his family. Of Manson's original family, only 3 are left in Los Angeles. The rest are either in jail or in hiding, taking care of the Manson children.
We don't even think about him not coming out because he is. He is going to get out. And he'll be out when all the jails open up and everybody's going to be free.
Despite being on trial, Manson's influence over his followers is evident.
I feel good feelings towards everything. I feel no bad. I know no bad. I'm not against you. I'm not against you. Huh?
Are you bitter?
Bitter? No. No.
You paid some price so far.
Price?
So he had a lot of time with Patricia, Susan, and Leslie, because they'd do crazy things, so they would get kicked out of the trial, and they could have a meeting in the back. So that way he could have his time with them and keep them on the right path, as far as he was concerned.
His influence extends even outside of the courtroom walls.
One day, Squeaky, who visited him more than anyone, she was kind of like the manager, said, "We're going to take off." So we started driving to the Sunset Strip, and then she said, "We're all going to take acid, and we're going to crawl back to the Hall of Justice to show the world how much we all love Charlie."
They even try to pull Aesop into their plans.
There were a couple of things that happened out at the ranch that I was not comfortable with, but I sort of let pass. But when one of the girls comes up and says, "We want you to kill the judge," I'm going, and I don't know if it was that night. Very soon, I walked away, like in the middle of the night. I just said, enough's enough. I have no reason to want to be here. And I left.
The penalty phase of the trial begins Thursday. Some say this could last 2 months or even more. Defense attorneys and the defendants will no longer argue innocence or guilt, but rather life or death.
On January the 25th, 1971, after 10 days of deliberation, the jury give their verdict.
What is the verdict? For all of them?
Yeah, for all of them.
You know what? The system has just judged itself. It's just judged itself. It's all a matter of time now.
And of course, then when the death penalty was revoked in California, the sentence was changed to life imprisonment.
Each one of the jailed Manson family has been trying for parole, but the tide has been against them, and they will most likely never see the outside again. Charles Manson died in prison on November 19th, 2017.
It's people that stop thinking for themselves, and they take one person with charisma and this strong personality, and they believe everything they say, and stop thinking themselves and stop doubting.
When one person wants to totally manipulate and overwhelm another person, is just to shower them with this love and affection. And it's like a drug. You want that more, you want it more and more.
So I was at a point where, why think about it? There's nowhere to go. I'm being threatened. These are the only people that I have. So I just totally shut down and did what was expected of me.
They call themselves the Children of God, a doomsday religious cult with some wild beliefs.
We always grew up thinking that the world was going to end within our lifetimes before we even reached adulthood.
And some shocking and less than godly practices.
So there was a huge amount of sexual abuse that went on in the cult, including myself. I was sexually abused at age 4 by a man who was looking after us children, the group I was in.
But unlike other end-of-day religious groups, this one allows and even encourages orgies, prostitution, and child molestation. Their founder and leader was David Berg.
God now only has one law, the law of love.
I met his daughter. I met his granddaughter. They were both raped by him. His granddaughter was held in a cage, and she was physically abused and sexually raped over and over again. So what kind of a man does that? Is he following in the steps of the disciples of Jesus?
David Berg has been dead now for over a quarter century. But the impact of his teachings still casts a long shadow. From sunny California in the 60s, a late-blooming preacher named David Berg will lead his followers to commit some of the darkest, most depraved acts ever committed in the name of the Lord. Yet it all seems so wholesome when it begins. In the late 60s, along with hippies, Haight-Ashbury, and flower power, a new kind of Christianity emerges. Some call them Jesus freaks. They look like hippies and even talk about finding God as the ultimate trip.
All the pill anybody needs is the gospel. And when you're on the gospel and you're rushing with Jesus, it's like really when you get loaded on the Lord, you don't have to hit up. All you got to do is just rush with Jesus because you've hit up on the greatest trip there is.
60s Jesus freaks look quaint to us now, but there was a darker side to one of the groups. They are initially called Teens for Christ, and their leader is one David Berg.
When you were in California, there were a lot of young people. He would go to the beaches and they would bring guitars, and it would be the attraction to get the young people around them.
David Berg is pushing 50 at the time of the Summer of Love, but he adopts the look and some of the attitudes of the counterculture.
Part of the attraction was he dressed like the hippies as well. So he would wear these cloak type garments and sunglasses and beret hats. So he really made himself fit in despite being so much older than the people he was recruiting.
From these humble beginnings in a Californian beachside coffee shop, this organization will become a global concern. David Berg establishes missions all over the world. But as this end of days movement grows, rumors of wide-scale fringe treatment of children begin to circulate, along with cases of adult prostitution. The prostitution is out there, hiding in plain sight. They call it flirty fishing. It's a radical way of reaching out to new converts, dreamt up by David Berg.
And we didn't feel like we were being bad girls. We just felt like we were on a mission to help people. And that was my way of helping them. And I wanted to be compliant with the rules of the letters, so I did that. Although for me, I had to stay drunk each time.
Women from the sect bring lonely men into the group. All of them have their stories.
I met him at a hotel. He had thick glasses, he had bad breath, he was a broken man. His wife left him, she took the car, she took the house, she took the children, and I ministered to him spiritually from my knowledge of the Bible.
But there are more serious sex crimes going on inside the children of God than flirty fishing.
Communes in a number of countries, like this one in Argentina, have been raided as part of child abuse inquiries. The sect says nothing has been proved.
Eventually, there will be raids on their compounds and communes from Argentina to Manchester. But the cold fact is, David Berg will never be brought to trial, nor even be arrested. This middle-aged lay preacher is an unlikely candidate to be a beacon for the love generation.
His parents were pretty well-known preachers, so he grew up in that environment. He had a relatively strict upbringing. At some point, well, he was pretty much, I think, what you'd consider a loser.
His mother was quite a famous evangelical preacher in the United States.
Virginia Brandt Berg even has her own gospel radio program, Meditation Moments.
Greetings again in His name, and God bless you. Welcome you again to Meditation Moments. We're so glad that some of you have written us.
David Berg's home life seems repressive, especially by today's standards. According to his own writings, while an adolescent, Berg's mother catches him masturbating. She orders him to complete the act, while the whole family watches. If Berg's story is true, it might help explain a few things. The years pass. While on the road with his mother, David Berg meets and marries a woman named Jane Miller. They begin a young family of their own and take to the road, singing hallelujah and preaching the good book.
Moses David Berg would try to act very contemporary, very cool. Again, he would try to act like, hey, I'm a Jesus freak. I'm one of the Jesus people.
Down on his luck and low on money, in 1967, Berg takes a job running a coffee shop in Huntington Beach, California, a popular hangout spot for hippie youth. While working there, Berg hits upon a new way to reach out to potential young converts. If you can't beat them, join them.
So he might wear fashionable outfits, a beret, sunglasses, whatever, to look like he was cool. But he was anything but cool.
After decades of failure, David Berg has finally discovered the formula to create his own religious sect. His disciples are adolescent refugees from the drugs and excess of the 60s. If only they knew what they were really signing up for. In the 1960s, during the so-called Summer of Love, a burnt-out evangelical preacher has found a way to connect with a new generation. His name is David Berg, and the movement is the Children of God. At first sight, they seem much like the other Jesus freaks of the era, but David Berg is driven by dark impulses that will poison the lives of many. At first, it all seems so innocent and utopian.
Oh, I love you, I love you. And then you come down the stairs and they just, oh, I love you, I love you.
The Children of God become a magnet for lost souls, some of whom claim to find peace and joy with the group, at least at the outset.
I joined the cult when I was 25 years old. I was dancing topless in Texas, and I was on my way to commit suicide when I met two members of the Children of God. I needed a plastic card to break into someone's apartment because I was going to commit suicide that day. They were really sweet, very loving. They asked me what my problems were, very embracing. So I thought, well, I'll talk to these guys for a while and, hold off on the suicide.
They have found so much joy, so much love in knowing Jesus, that when they come here, they say, man,
yes.
forget all the rest of it. I've tried all that, and I know it didn't work.
This is Linda Berg, David Berg's elder daughter. Many years later in the 1980s, she will publish a book detailing the abuses she suffered and that she claims went on inside the Children of God. And yet, in the early days, some people did feel they had been saved. The Children of God, after all, take their message to the street, to where people live.
And I went with him. He suggested that I receive Jesus in my heart, which is a very strange concept because we were in an alley. I kind of sarcastically said, okay, that's what you want me to do. So I did. I closed my eyes and I prayed with him to receive Jesus. And I had a salvation experience where I had peace that was like amazing.
At first, the sect is quite puritanical. No drugs, alcohol, or sex outside of marriage. By now, David Berg has no qualms about saying God is speaking through him, and through him alone.
He was God's chosen end-time prophet. At some point, he started getting revelations about that the world was going to end for a number of years, and that he was God's end-time prophet, the last prophet that would lead God's church through the end of the world, through the last days.
But during the Vietnam War, it seemed that everyone was politicizing, including the children of God. They brought their zealous anti-war, anti-decadence message to unwelcomed places with predictable results. Such was this silent protest at a Texas high school football game. Their very presence often leads to confrontation.
You guys ought to get a job, man. You make me sick. What are you doing out here? You know, our boys are dying in Vietnam right now, and you're out here picking it against this country? You make me sick, boy. Hey, you make me sick. I tell you make me sick. Makes me sick!
The children of God are not only convinced that America is decadent, but they believe that the world will end in 1993.
We always grew up thinking that the world was going to end within our lifetimes before we even reached adulthood. So basically that meant that nothing was planned long term. Children didn't need education because, you know, by the time we were 12 or teenagers, the world was going to end. So what's the point?
So the brainwashing was consistent, it was daily, with no let up. And considering we were born into this cult and knew nothing else, we didn't really stand a chance of having any other mentality than the one we were being given.
New members are directed to forsake their parents, their family, in favor of the sect, which is to be their new family.
Basically, they didn't believe in necessarily keeping the family structure. So it was just another casualty.
It depended, if it suited the cult's purposes to break up a family, then they would.
We only really saw our parents on Sundays.
Little by little, David Berg is taking control of every aspect of members' lives. Yet he is absent in hippie-era news reports about the children of God. It's only a few years after he founded the sect, but already he has begun to live like a recluse. People begin to ask questions.
How is it that your father, according to his critics, surrounds himself with such secrecy?
It's not really secrecy. It's very simple that he's a man who enjoys his private life, and men like Howard Hughes, they just don't like the spotlight.
Eventually, there will be long-term members who never once meet the man.
I personally never met Berg, and that was the case, I would say, for about 97% of members in the cult.
Berg not only lives apart from his followers, but in far greater comfort. But where does the money come from for his lifestyle?
Well, the thing is, when you join the children of God, you forsake all. You give everything you have. Anything coming in goes to the group. It goes to the cult. So that's how they secure a lot of their income.
It made me very angry years later when I realized that David Berg and his immediate group around him lived in absolute luxury most of the time, you know, in big houses and exotic locations with pools, with wonderful food. He was an alcoholic as well for most of his life.
While David Berg drank, he wrote. He created the Moses Letters and also the Moses Comics, which came complete with cartoon illustrations. These writings contain instructions that touch upon every aspect of members' lives.
And we followed blindly. He dictated what we ate, how we dressed, how we act, finances, He had control of our minds.
They didn't believe very much in medicines or in doctors because God was supposed to heal us. I got pretty sick when I was a child. Actually had an accident and I broke my arm. And we did not go to the hospital for about a week afterwards because we prayed for it. And when the prayer didn't work, we went and found out that it was broken and that I had a tumor in my arm. And that kind of went on for a whole 6 months. They would bring me in the evening to when all the adults would meet, and they'd all lay hands on me and they would pray, they would rebuke the demons. And so I would believe it, and every time I'd go for an x-ray, I would expect that it would be healed, except that it never did. So I did eventually have to go have an operation.
Still worse treatment of children is yet to come. The so-called Word of God, as interpreted by David Berg, will lead his followers and their children to the darkest realms of human behavior.
The time to be happy is now, and the place to be happy is here. And the way to be happy is to make others happy, and we'll have a little heaven right here.
Out of the Jesus freak scene of the 1960s, a man named David Berg has set himself up as a doomsday prophet and the leader of a group called Children of God. They see themselves as saving souls before the end times. But David Berg presents himself as the only path to salvation. Followers must obey his every word. Living in seclusion, he lays down the law in letters and even illustrated comics. At some point in the 70s, Berg claims to have a revelation from the Lord. He calls it the law of love.
Only has one law, the law of love.
One of Berg's great revelations was the law of love, which basically became his excuse for doing whatever he wanted to, as long as it was done with love, then, you know, it couldn't be wrong. There's no way it can be wrong. So, that's basically the way he would excuse, having sex with children or being polygamous, having sex with whoever within the communes. We grew up with sex just all around us. There was absolutely no veto on anything that had to do with sex as far as the children were concerned. We saw adults having sex constantly. We saw our parents having sex constantly. Some kids also had sex with adults. We were drawn sex. We were told about sex. Sex was just everywhere.
In August of 1969, David Berg abandons his wife Jane and takes his young secretary as his common-law wife. This is Karen Zerby, and she's roughly 25 years younger than Berg. They live in seclusion from the Children of God communes, but keep in contact and in control by CB radio, books, and comics. One of Berg's publications is called Heaven's Girl. It would be hard to imagine a more inappropriate role model for young girls.
Heaven's Girl was a series of publications that were sent out very much aimed at children and teenagers in the cult. And it was basically a fiction book about a heroine, someone who became quite a superhero to us children, whose name was Heaven's Girl. And it was basically her doing what we were expected to do in the end time, so in the last days of the world. And she's being persecuted, she's being pursued by the Antichrist soldiers, and all sorts of challenges come along her way, and she's, at one point gang raped by a group of soldiers and has to turn that into an opportunity to win them over to Christ through giving her body willingly.
What they relied on were his writings and these little comic books that would say basically that loving meant sex, and that loving the children with Christ-like love meant sexualizing them, and that everyone should have this, and everyone should treat their children to this.
Not only is this so-called religious group now allegedly engaging in wife-swapping, orgies, and child molestation, they even use sex as a way to lure new members and raise money.
Then there was also something called the FFing revolution, which was flirty fishing. They would send women into hotels or bars to go and basically chat up the businessmen, the rich people that were there on work, under the pretext of speaking to them about Jesus, but really they were just being hookers. They would get a lot of money from these men as well.
We believe with our whole heart that if people were in need, you would give them the compassion and the love to help them through to be able to receive peace and love in Jesus. That was the premise of flirty fishing.
Moses David Berg mandated flirty fishing, which became hookers for Christ, and it can be seen as religious prostitution because the group was supposedly religious, and it mandated that women raise money for the group through prostitution.
It jumped from this concept of winning souls to Christ to the women going out and having sex with strangers in exchange pretty much for financial donations, which I like to call religious prostitution, because that's exactly what it was. I feel so sorry for these women because they were so deeply manipulated at that point that they didn't even have a choice, you know? And to be used like that in that way is just horrific.
Hookers for Jesus. It might sound funny to some, but there is nothing amusing about life inside the sect, especially not if you are born into it and have no choice.
As a child growing up in the cult, the majority of the time I spent in the cult was in Thailand, and the communes were very much like a prison camp.
It is this second generation that carries with them the most pain and kind of psychic scars that maybe never heal.
It was very extreme, very harsh, and certainly not appropriate levels of physical violence. You know, for a long time, I didn't see it for what it really was, which was beating children. You know, it wasn't your regular spanking that, you know, some people give to their children, you know, they'll swat with their hand or anything. It was full-on beatings.
David Berg's comic books might have portrayed the Children of God activities as fun and lighthearted, but everyone who didn't follow orders was punished.
Punishments would vary. There was obviously physical beatings, spankings. There was usually someone designated to do it. And they obviously had a special amount of fear that they instilled in you. There was denying of things. There was taking away of privileges constantly.
It was ridiculous. These poor teens were looking up to us for answers, and they get in trouble for being honest. And as brainwashed as we were, we considered them a problem.
There was also washing mouth out with a soap. So you'd get a soap bar and you'd have to wash your mouth with soap because you said something that wasn't of Jesus.
Little doubt, David Berg had some very strange ideas about what is of Jesus. Meanwhile, the various communes became expert at sealing themselves off from the outside world.
There were raids periodically on the communities of the Children of God. There would be raids in Australia, in South America, but many times these raids produced no meaningful results because the communities were very adept and very well rehearsed at what to say and how to handle situations like that.
Of child abuse, it's taking away children. Adults and children have no sexual relationships whatsoever, and it's strictly forbidden within our community, and if anybody ever did anything like that, they would be immediately asked to leave.
We lived out of little suitcases because we had to be ready at a moment's notice to flee because there was either cops chasing us or with the end of the world, we had to be ready for the Great Tribulation. The very little bit that you possessed was in a little bag.
And there is a lot, after all, to hide. As we have seen with his writings, David Berg is actively promoting sexual relations between adults and minors. But is this just his fevered imagination at work? Many believe Berg is involved in the sexual molestation of his daughters, his stepson, and his granddaughter. It can't go on like this. Something has to give.
A lot of men made sexual advances towards me, and not only to me, but to many other young girls in the group. And it was accepted, and in actual fact, David Berg wrote about it, and he actually practiced it himself. And if you had the faith, if you had the spirit, you could also practice it yourself with your children or with other girls in the home.
What's wrong with kissing, hugging? What's wrong with love? Don't try to figure it out. We couldn't live without love.
From a coffee shop on a beach in 60s California, in the space of a decade, a doomsday prophet creates an organization with global reach. Living in seclusion, he retains control with letters and comics that prophesize the end of days, and also preaches so-called law of love.
The 10 Commandments were done away with by the law of Jesus Christ, the law of love. God now only has one law, the law of love.
This is a license for prostitution, partner swapping, and most disturbingly, child abuse. His real name is David Berg, but he calls himself Moses, or Moses David, at other times Mo. Many of his followers refer to him as Dad.
He was known predominantly in the cult as Dad, so the adults would call him Dad, we children would call him Grandpa. He was also known as Moses David, Mo, and quite a few other names.
In his illustrated writings, David Berg is often depicted as a wise and kind-looking lion. What photos there are of him show an avuncular man with a Santa Claus beard. But this man is farther from a Santa than anyone could imagine.
David Berg's personality was deeply narcissistic, self-obsessed. He was a megalomaniac, in my opinion, and he had no sense of propriety, no kind of moral compass, because he would rape his daughter, his granddaughter, and molest his own children. He was a monster. He was a pedophile. He had a predilection to molest little children, and he taught it as a doctrine.
In the late 1970s, David Berg issues a series of his illustrated writings he calls The Story of David Ito. This is supposed to be a guide to bringing up children, but it is more like an instruction manual for pedophiles.
And of course, then we had the David Ito storybook that came out around that time, where they experimented sexually on him when he was as young as a toddler. So if you're putting out a book with images of a toddler receiving a sexual act, then you're basically telling people, this is fine, go ahead and do it, it's all right.
It all seems hard to believe. Then in 2005, the model for David Ito does something to make sure the whole world is paying attention.
I got stuck because there's this need that I have. This need, it's not a want, it's a need, and I wish it wasn't, but it is. It's a need for revenge. It's a need for justice. Because I can't go on like this.
Born in Tenerife in 1975, Ricky Rodriguez is the son of David Berg's wife, Karen Zerbe, and a man she picked up while flirty fishing. David Berg effectively adopts the young boy.
And he was raised as kind of a prince who would inherit the kingdom of the children of God. He was looked up to, highly regarded by members of the group. At the same time, though, Ricky Rodriguez was being sexually molested repeatedly, and he was a victim.
Because I would not want to have to go through in another dimension what I'm going through here, and what I had been through.
Ricky Rodriguez's adopted father, David Berg, his biological mother, Karen Zerbe, and even the family nanny, one Susan Joy Cotton, according to the video recorded by Ricky before his suicide, all are apparently involved in his abuse.
The nanny of Karen Zerbe's kid, she was regularly participating in sexual acts with the kid, and it was documented and shared with all of the cult, everybody in it, that he had been fondled and stuff as a child. We knew it from reading the Davidito book. So to see how much it affected him and how much he hated his parents was quite a wake-up call for a lot of us.
In February 1999, while in his 20s, Rodriguez decides to leave the Children of God. With a young wife who is also a former member, he tries to live a peaceful and constructive life. But like so many others, he cannot forget what he and others like him were put through.
You know, aren't they the real terrorists? Terrorizing little kids? Driving them to suicide? Isn't that like murdering them, basically? With their mind so much that they can't go on? They really can't go on. Isn't that like killing them? Bastards.
10 years after David Berg's death, Ricky Rodriguez's life is still in turmoil, and he makes a plan to kill his mother, Karen Zerbe, if only he can find her. But Zerbe has gone into hiding. He meets with his former nanny to interrogate her. Things get out of hand, way out of hand. Ricky Rodriguez stabs his former nanny 3 times, then slits her throat with his K-bar knife.
Ricky Rodriguez never really recovered from all the abuse that he experienced. And eventually he killed the woman who molested him. And after he killed her in Arizona, he then went to California in his car and killed himself.
The tragic tale of Ricky Rodriguez is the only murder case that can be directly linked to David Berg and the Children of God. But it is far from the only instance of suicide.
There's a high suicide rate of young people who left this cult. Like, statistically speaking, there are quite a few. I know quite a few, we all know quite a few people personally.
David Berg has been dead for a decade when Ricky Rodriguez captures world headlines with a murder-suicide. Gradually, other former members begin to tell their stories too, in court and to the media. In a child custody case in Britain, Berg's granddaughter, Mary Berg, testifies that he sexually molested her when she was a young teenager. Several years afterwards, VHS tapes come to light, which show how children inside the group were definitely being sexualized.
It was super weird. Kids dancing. I danced as well. You just had to do it. You didn't understand, but you did it.
I saw those videos as well. Those kids were young. They shouldn't have been out there dancing. It was not cool, obviously.
So it came out many years later that David Berg had actually sexually molested 2 of his daughters and one of his granddaughters who lived with him for a period. He actually published a letter about his granddaughter in which he had a dream that was sexual, and she was in it.
Basically, she had been taken into Berg's inner circle when she was very young, and then she was abused for many years. And when she started becoming a teenager, she wasn't quite as, she started becoming what they call rebellious.
To be a rebellious child in the Children of God means refusing to go along with yet more abuse. And there are punishments for that. Berg and his group conduct a kind of exorcism to drive the devil out of her.
She totally lost it at the hand of David Berg and the team that were in that house.
In 2017, Mary Berg dies in her sleep due to respiratory failure. Tragedy of tragedies, after leaving the sect and then struggling with addiction and life on the street, she had begun at last to find some direction and some peace. David Berg has indeed cast a long, dark shadow. They call themselves the Children of God, later the Family. Their founder, David Berg, preaches what he calls the law of love. But what goes on inside the group is hard to believe. Group orgies and wife swapping, so-called hookers for Christ that lure new converts, and worse still, widespread child abuse. The story of David Ito, monitoring the life of Ricky Rodriguez, was distributed to all the group. The stories inside were idyllic on the surface, but far from the horrible truth. Consequences of Ricky's mistreatment as a child eventually lead to the death of his nanny Susan Joy Cowton and Ricky's suicide. Another victim of similar molestation was Mary Berg, David Moses' own granddaughter. Since the sect's beginning, Berg also prophesies the apocalypse or end times. He is quite specific. The world will end in the year 1993.
One of the big prophecies was that the world was going to end in 1993. Before that, there was supposed to be the Great Tribulation, so 7 years of turmoil in the world, and then after that, the rapture, and the world would end.
You don't have to pay much attention to history to know the world doesn't end in 1993.
He said that God was giving us more time to reach more people so that we could bring more people to heaven. But he decided we needed to go and witness some more to get more people to go to heaven.
David Berg dies in 1994 at the age of 75 without ever having been arrested. But he leaves behind a legacy of pain and despair, especially among the children of the Children of God.
So when I was age 4, I was sexually abused on multiple occasions by a person who was looking after the group I was in. I didn't speak about the abuse I suffered for a good 10 years. I believe I then told one of the adults in the home, and I was told to get over it and to pray and ask Jesus to help me to get over it. That was it. That was the end of the conversation.
People may well ask, why didn't members just leave as soon as they legally became adults? After a lifetime of indoctrination, that's easier said than done. Testimonials from members who had been on the outside are designed to scare children brought up in the sect into staying where they are.
The outside world seemed like a very horrible place in which we would either become alcoholics or drug addicts or broke or suffer many horrible things because they were trying to keep us scared from leaving, or just always making us be aware that the outside world was a terrible place and that we were very blessed to be inside.
When you decide to leave a cult, the biggest fears you might have are losing your family and friends and no longer being able to see them. There's also the fear of not making it in the outside world. Now, if ever you go out, you're gonna, something will happen to you. Something bad.
Despite all their fears and the indoctrination they have been subjected to, as a new century begins, more and more people find the courage to leave the group for good.
The day that it actually hit me that I needed to just get the courage and leave was just like a flash of lightning. That just said to me, I cannot live a day longer of this horrible lie because it's just eating me. It's nonsense. And it's not real, and it's not me, and I need to leave, and I need to leave now, like right this minute. It was like I cannot even stay another minute.
I just went out into the world completely unprepared. You know, we were given no knowledge of what was out there. We had no idea about practical things such as, you know, what a CV was, how to look for a job, how to open a bank account. We were literally like newborn babies mentally being thrown out into the world, you know, which of course meant that we were very vulnerable because we were so naive. You know, there's quite a few ex-members that were, you know, victims of crime or who fell into abusive relationships, for example, which I did as well.
Many who leave do find life in the outside world difficult at first. But human beings can be amazingly resilient. Some ex-members manage not only to survive, but even to thrive. But what about the sect that David Berg founded? Surely you think they must have been disbanded a long time ago. But not so fast. The sect attempted to distance itself from Berg's pedophilic dogma, especially after his death in 1994. It wanted to be seen as a legitimate international religious sect and issued charters that allowed for personal careers and independence from the residential family unit.
Children of God is now called the Family International. They say they've changed. They will say over and over again in interviews, we've changed. We're not like we used to be. We're the Family International.
The Family International continue as an organization to this day. A quick search online and you can find them. They are run by David Berg's second wife, Karen Zerby, and a man named Steve Kelly, who had been David Berg's close associate. Today they are better known by their pen names, Maria Fontaine and Peter Amsterdam. In 2008, the family's leadership apologized to children who had been harmed. The group offered them a chance to come forth, talk to their parents, and seek counseling. The family offered the services of a psychologist, but no one requested them.
When I have talked to people in leadership and said, well, how do you see Moses David Berg now? Do you see that he was wrong? Do you see that his teachings were pernicious, that they were destructive, that people were hurt because of him? Or do you still think he was a prophet? And they won't answer.
David Berg has long gone, but what about justice for his willing co-conspirators?
It's actually shocking how few first-generation abusers were prosecuted. There were a couple cases, but the majority of them are still living off in whatever country, and I think that's probably why it's so hard to prosecute them, is because a lot of them have changed their names tons of times. They never use their legal names when in the cult, so we don't even know what their legal names are. And most of them, they just live in third world countries.
Not surprisingly, some ex-members would like to confront Karen Zerby directly.
I would say to her, be honest, live your own preachings. As a Christian, you should know that being truthful is one of the most important things. And the fact that she continuously denies her involvement in everything that happened in the past just makes it's sort of a double injury, because she was heavily involved in producing the story of Davidito, in producing all of the publications about child sex.
And still, there are some who were involved in the sect at the highest levels who prefer to remember the early days, the good times in the children of God.
Things are not black and white. It was fun. It was radical. We were going to go all over the world and preach the gospel to every creature. I was on my way to commit suicide when I met them. So that saved my life. But it was Jesus, not Moses David. There's the difference.
The difference between the actual teachings of Jesus and the mad ravings of David Berg could not be more stark. The survivors have to somehow find a way to live their best lives.
You know, and that's my priority, is just to be happy. And that's the best way to beat them when you can't take them to a court of law, which we've struggled to do, is to beat them by just being happy and letting them know that, you know, you did what you did to us, but it doesn't matter. We're still going to live. We're still going to be happy, and you're not going to take that from us.
It's the most beautiful place I've ever been in all my life.
I really appreciate being here, being able to work under Father's direction.
How long would you like to stay?
Forever.
Jim Jones became a control freak, a tyrant, a liar. It was an emotional breakdown.
People's Temple didn't start that way. It was a slow evolving
into what it became in the end.
Nightmare. Nightmare.
A place of paradise that became a hell for hundreds of people who'd put their faith in him.
It's the late 1960s. The United States is a country in turmoil. The generation gap emerges as the youth of America voices fierce opposition to the Vietnam War and demands civil rights, gender equality, and social change. The sexual revolution is in full swing. In this time of great upheaval, influential figures step in to lead counterculture movements. A dynamic leader named Jim Jones offers wide-ranging solutions that strike a chord with many of these disaffected young people. Jones seems to really understand their pressing concerns.
I had never seen a pastor that was cursing out of the pulpit. I just had never seen that. But even though I thought he was an entertainer, he was very interesting. I felt enthusiastic about some of the things that he said, and he was charismatic.
His message is more than just religious. Jones preaches a more egalitarian society where all are included, regardless of race, gender, or social class.
I had always been involved and interested in leftist movements, in anything that was progressive. Since I was estranged from my family, the church became my family. They became my support.
I became my own brand of Marxist. Scratch looking into childhood. Would I could talk as well as I think. That's presumptuous, but thoughts move rapidly through the mind, and it's difficult to capture them, to type them, to verbalize them.
Jim Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in the tiny town of Crete, Indiana. As an only child, he spends a lot of time alone, wandering the streets of his small town. But one day, a neighbor woman takes him to the church. This becomes the turning point in Jones' life.
So he fell in love with this idea of becoming a preacher. And while other kids would play doctor and patient or school, Jim Jones would start playing preacher and congregant with his buddies.
While still a teenager, his parents divorce, and Jones moved with his mother to Richmond, Indiana, a racially segregated city. And Jim Jones decides to take a stand against this injustice.
He would stand out on a street corner and preach this message to African Americans who were passing by. So he was able to adopt this message from the Bible about equality and Christian inclusion and all are welcome, and find a ready crowd of listeners who wanted to hear this.
In 1949, when Jim Jones is just 18, he marries Marceline Baldwin. And 2 years later, the couple moved to Indianapolis, where Jones attends meetings at the local chapter of the Communist Party, and he embraces the ideals of Marxism.
I decided, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? The thought was, infiltrate the church.
Jones soon becomes a student minister at a local Methodist church. He starts inviting black families to attend Sunday services, a move that shocks the members of the all-white congregation.
He was essentially ousted and told that this was not okay. It's all fine and good for white worshipers white believers to say that they believe in equality, but it was another thing for them to stand side by side with Black Christians and believers sharing a Bible or a hymnal. So what did he do? He decided to create his own church where all were welcome.
In 1954, Jones establishes the Community Unity Church and encourages all races to attend his services. Around this time, Jones witnesses a faith healing service at a Seventh-day Adventist Baptist church. He sees how faith healing attracts people and their money. Motivated by this income, he brings this practice into his services.
I became a member, of course, of the choir. I joined the church. I would go out on Saturdays like a dutiful little member of People's Temple with a can. I would stand on corners, go to neighbors in the area that we lived in San Francisco, begging for donations to support the ministry of People's Temple. There were hundreds of us doing the same thing all over San Francisco. It was being reduplicated in Los Angeles. It was being duplicated in Redwood Valley. Anywhere, anyone who came in contact with People's Temple that ultimately became a member felt that that was one of their areas of responsibility.
Jones and his wife set an example for the congregation by adopting multiracial children, calling themselves the Rainbow Family. The racial backlash against him is intense. Undaunted, Jones renames his church the People's Temple and expands his community activities. He opens a soup kitchen and organizes clothing distribution for the needy. Jim Jones starts to get positive media attention. They view him as a civil rights leader in turbulent times.
He could speak to anyone. When he could speak to a revolutionary and say, we can change the world, and he could speak to an atheist and say, you don't have to believe in God, whatever he spoke about with the power and passion that he did it with, inspired everyone and would make people just clap and sing and shout and joyful. It was an amazing experience.
But despite his growing success, everything changes for Jim Jones when he receives a terrifying vision. At a time when segregation has many Americans feeling excluded and oppressed, a young, charismatic religious leader named Jim Jones brings a message of hope. He founds the People's Temple, a rapidly growing movement who stands for a fair society where all people can live as equals, regardless of race, gender, or class, challenging the dominant prejudices that still divide society in the 1950s and 60s, becoming not only a successful preacher, but also a praised human rights activist. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union is escalating, a conflict that has a deep effect on Jones, causing him to experience terrifying nightmares.
And in 1965, he told people that he had a vision that a bomb was going to fall on the Midwest and that they had to get out.
Jones and 140 of his congregants pack up and travel in a caravan of cars from Indiana to Redwood Valley, California.
The real story behind that move is he is trying to figure out who really believes in his message.
The People's Temple establishes a socialist-style commune. Their message resonates with Californians, and they are soon joined by new congregants from all over the state. These new members are asked to dedicate most of their free time to working for the community.
I started doing security at night, even while I was pregnant. There was letter writing campaigns at night. It might go into the wee hours of the morning, and you had to go to school. I remember taking no-dos all night long because I had a chemistry test the next day, and I knew I couldn't go to sleep. And so that's the stress that we were under, making sure that we performed and making Jim happy.
Another measure to support their socialist ideals is the sharing of wealth. Members are encouraged to not only donate their savings, but also their entire salaries to the Common Temple Fund.
I saw most people who lived communally giving their entire checks, and then they were given $5 a week. They would bring peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch on a regular basis. And then towards the end of the week, when they would go to a church service, they would be begged to no end out of their $5. So then they wouldn't have any money.
Members are also expected to share or sell their goods and property, with the proceeds going to the church.
The dream, or the cause, was to provide a different reality, a positive community building experience where everybody could be a part of and experience life more fully. And it wouldn't matter if you were young or old, or if you'd had money or you didn't have money.
Jones establishes Wednesday night catharsis sessions, where members are called out in front of the group for not willingly participating in the plan. Eventually, they are punished.
Oftentimes, their punishment would be they would be hit with the paddle, the Board of Education, as they called it, a big wooden paddle. And you'd watch them get spanked. It would be children, it would be adults, it would be older folks, younger folks. It made no difference.
They were being enemies of the people, enemies of the cause, and that so they were being punished to kind of put people back in line. And so that was normalized.
I remember my first day of junior high school, and I was talking to this girl, and this young girl comes over and she says, "Are you from People's Temple?" And I said, "Yes, I go to People's Temple." She goes, "You can't talk to any other kids but Temple kids." So I thought that was my first introduction of the beginning of isolation.
You know, it was a very isolated mentality. It's us versus them. It's very black and white thinking. You're either a friend or you're an enemy. You're a friend or a foe. There's no in between.
Jim Jones' utopia is developing according to plan, but he craves more power and decides to expand further. He determines he needs to be in a larger city, so the congregation moves its headquarters into a former Masonic temple in San Francisco. They establish a significant following in this city, as well as in a branch in Los Angeles. Jim Jones is constantly on the move, often touring nationally. Yet he never shows any signs of fatigue. His speeches are always wildly energetic.
So one day on a bus trip from San Francisco to LA, one of his disciples, one of his close associates, went into the bathroom in the bus and saw Jim Jones's toiletry bag, and inside there was a vial of speed. That's where his stamina came from. He was high on speed.
Jones' drug use increases. He also starts to have affairs with both the women and men in the congregation.
And then oftentimes, to make sure that he kept the husband and the wife in alignment, he would sleep with other people's mates and whatnot. And he would always say he had to do it for the cause, because they were getting ready to leave the church, and he had to find some way to make them feel obligated to stay and work for the cause.
On the outward face of things, he looked progressive. He had this message of inclusion, of equality, of social justice. And as he drew more and more African Americans to his church, some of the young people noticed certain things.
Members start to defect, and Jones becomes more paranoid and manipulative. Cult leaders offer followers the message they want to hear. But once they get the loyalty of their members, they become controlling and abusive. One of Jones' key strategies is to keep his members in line in order to create a climate of external threat by simulating attacks. One Sunday morning, while leaving the church after services, congregants are shocked by the sound of gunshots.
They bring him out and people are crying and gathering around. And what happens? He heals himself because he's becoming God.
Another insidious form of manipulation is the requirement that anyone over the age of 12 must sign a blank piece of paper. These signed papers can later be filled out to incriminate them in offenses they haven't committed.
And you did it because you did not want to be the member in the church that refused to do it and be brought up front and center on the stage and be ostracized, be beaten up, or maybe excommunicated.
By this time, Jim Jones starts speaking more and more of unconditional loyalty to the temple, inciting his followers to be willing to give their lives for the socialist cause. And he devises cruel methods to test their loyalty.
Then one day, we had come up from eating our communal dinner downstairs, and he asked us if we all enjoyed our meals, and we said, yeah. And then he said, well, that's good, because this is going to be the last one. We're going to die together.
According to Jones, the meal was poisoned.
And after a few minutes, he laughed, and he said, no, I didn't do that. He said, I just wanted to see which ones of you were really loyal and committed to the cause.
Like any good manipulator, Jim Jones always knew how to show his followers his softer side.
There was this side that you saw, which is what people fell in love with, I believe. It's like an abusive relationship. And then all of a sudden you see the sadistic part and you wonder, okay, well, I must have done something wrong.
The congregation keeps growing, becoming an influential voting bloc in the state of California. In 1975, local politicians court the movement for local elections. The temple endorses the campaigns of George Moscone for mayor, Harvey Milk for councilman, and Joseph Freitas for district attorney.
And then on election day, some of them actually cross voting lines and vote for these candidates. He gets his slate elected, and as a reward, George Moscone, the new mayor, appoints him to the housing authority.
Jones' notoriety also attracts some unwanted attention. A private citizen named David Kahn has several acquaintances among former temple members. Based on their troubling accounts, he starts a private investigation of the church. Kahn exposes Jones' abusive behavior, fraudulent activities, and tricks to deceive his followers, including his healings and prophecies.
He would slip little old ladies' quaaludes, which are potent tranquilizers, and knock them out, and then they would awake with a cast on their leg, and then people telling them, oh, you fell down, but it's okay. You broke your leg, but Father's gonna heal you. They had no recollection of this. So they would wheel these women into the church, and with great fanfare, Jim Jones would cut off their cast and then command them to get up and to walk and to dance. And there is a young reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle there, Marshall Kilduff. So he starts snooping around, and he starts having some of the people who left the church come and talk to him about some of these things that are going on behind closed doors that Jim Jones doesn't want anyone to talk about.
Jim Jones' influence with the media blocks the San Francisco Chronicle from publishing the story, but Kilduff manages to sell it to New West magazine. Soon the authorities start to get interested in the case. Feeling that his castle of cards is crumbling, Jim Jones decides to make one final move. He takes as many followers with him as he can, leading them to a gruesome fate. Jim Jones' influence with the media blocks the San Francisco Chronicle from publishing the story, but Kilduff manages to sell it to New West magazine. Soon the authorities start to get interested in the case. Feeling that his castle of cards is crumbling, Jim Jones decides to make one final move. He takes as many followers with him as he can, leading them to a gruesome fate.
But we have no place to go now. It's either go to someplace like Cuba, our promised land, which we are wanting to get out of the conflict between the capitalist and the socialist world, into a free socialist territory in the third world.
A few years earlier, the socialist government of Guyana offers plots of land to international organizations with the goal of increasing the production of food in the country. Jim Jones takes this opportunity to expand his church abroad and flee from California.
It was at that time that then we started to see a few members, as he called them, the pioneers, advancing ahead of the church members to start building and construction of what was going to be known as Jonestown.
It would be a place where children could run free, not have to worry about crime. We'd be able to leave our doors open. We could build the community as a community, grow our own food. Our seniors would be taken care of. Just this place of peace and harmony that we didn't have in the States.
I wish I can be glad for you guys, everybody over there. They come here in the promised land. I really do like it. It's fun over here. It's really good.
The grand exodus of us was in 1977. I came in March of 1978, and then everything came to an end.
As his followers arrive in Guyana, they soon understand that their expectations are far from the reality.
The first thing they asked us is for passport and money. So we told them we didn't have any money. And they kept begging for the passports. Look, Yolanda, this is just for safekeeping. Don't you trust us?
There's not enough housing for everyone. Old people are living in triple bunk beds, not 2 bunk beds, but 3, and having to climb up and falling down. And, you know, some of the cottages don't even have doors yet.
I was assigned to a cottage with maybe about 20 other guys in bunk beds, and there was a loft. I fortunately got to live in a loft with another guy, and I was assigned to the orchard crew that worked on the orchards. And we worked from sunup to sundown, like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., something like that in the fields.
Plumbing and sanitation are primitive, with cold showers and no proper toilets. The heat, mosquitoes, and tropical diseases quickly start to take a toll. Also, the thin jungle soil is too acidic to plant American crops, limiting the variety and quantity of food.
We never saw ground beef, we never saw steaks, we never saw eggs, we never had juice. We didn't have any of that. The only person who had it was Jim Jones. He had all of it.
And then manipulation starts.
I saw that the families being broken up. I saw little children reporting their parents. Jim Jones' philosophy was that the sickest relationships are the family relationships. So you might be raising someone else's children. So the children were separated from their parents and raised by others. And it was just basically a technique to break the family unit so that loyalties to family would be transferred to loyalties to him.
He says if they don't like living in Jonestown, they can swim home because he's not paying their airfare back to California. Yeah. What are you gonna do? There's one ham radio. That's their sole line of communication with the outside world. Nobody can use it but Jim Jones. So there was a PA system in Jonestown, and whenever Jim Jones' voice was heard over the PA system, everyone was expected to be quiet and listen.
Saw absolute anarchy, and they won't have it. So you'll see me when the lights get low. And for a long time you're going to see me when the lights get low. Because I will sneak up on you at any night, any hour.
It ultimately came down to when Jim Jones opened his mouth, everything was a lie. He didn't want us to read the newspapers. We didn't have newspapers when we were in Jonestown either. The news came from him, and it was fake news, but he was selling it as the real deal.
The government was going to build concentration camps to put black people in, that the CIA was going to come and get us, take the children. They knew that we were revolutionaries or communists or socialists. And there were factual things that were happening at the time that would support some of that thinking.
In Jonestown, you had to be engaged. There was no way out. So you either had to mentally prepare yourself to try to pretend like everything was okay, because paranoia was rampant.
Oh, you would never tell anyone verbally that you knew something was wrong. You'd be afraid to even tell your mate.
If you disobeyed the rules, you were exhibiting counter-revolutionary behavior that was a threat to the cause of socialism. And so people were encouraged to report anything that was against the rules, which included the worst thing you could probably say was, I want to get out of here, or I don't like this place, or disagree with Jones in any way whatsoever.
And the corporal punishment became more severe over the years, and we went then beyond beatings into literally what would be considered what you would do to a slave. It was just the worst, horrible type of cruelty and punishment that a human being could expect or accept.
And in the worst case scenarios, with people who complained or stood up to him, he would drug them with Thorazine, this very powerful sedative used on patients in mental hospitals, and keep them in what he called the special care unit, where they would disappear from Jonestown and just be drugged around the clock, just zombified with medicine.
The temple also had a house in nearby Georgetown where members of the congregation would deal with the new arrivals and supplies.
Debbie Imes had been the procurer for Georgetown, and she had been getting all of the food and whatnot and doing a pretty good job of procurement. But Jim Jones decided he wanted me to try my hands at it, so he had me primarily stationed in Georgetown.
At that house also lived a group of young, attractive women who would be known as the PR girls. Their aim was to get involved with Guyanese officials in order to get some influence with the local politicians.
When we got to the airport, it was very interesting. And they said, "Are these your suitcases?" And we're like, "Yeah." "What's your nature of business?" I said, "People's Temple Missionary Agricultural Project." "Oh, okay. They didn't even really search our suitcases like you should in customs. They just let it go through. The next thing I knew, there was like 3 big crates coming through. And they said, "These are yours too?" And I'm like, "No, that's not ours." And then Debbie gave me this funny look like I was supposed to acknowledge and accept that these were our boxes, our cargo boxes. So they came through with our stuff, and they never even opened the crates or anything. They just let it come through.
Guns were being sent down to Jonestown in false bottom crates, so they would get through the inspection process.
Ultimately, the guns are used to reinforce the sense of external threat.
There was the thing called the 7-day siege, where he orchestrated events that would appear to be threats from the outside, like rifle shots in the jungle, Well, one of his security guards or his sons was out there shooting to make it appear like there was the enemy without. That was out there in the jungle waiting for us. Because there were supposedly enemies out in the jungle, sometimes our meetings in the pavilion were surrounded with security guards with rifles. And the rifles were supposed to be pointed out to the jungle, to the enemy outside, but you had a feeling that they were really there for you.
And then comes the suicide drills.
The suicide drill was called the White Night, and it was a coming together of the community to talk about an unsurmountable challenge that is happening to the community, and that no other solution was possible except to commit revolutionary suicide.
He had them line up and he served them unsugared Flavor Aid and told them that they were going to commit revolutionary suicide. A couple people responded like, hell no, I'm not going to do this. So they were sent to the special care unit and pumped full of drugs.
It seemed like just more theatrics. I never imagined that it was ever going to happen, that it was just another way of him trying to control people.
After finding that his people's temple is under investigation, Jim Jones flees to Guyana and establishes a commune with 1,000 of his followers. But after isolating them from the world, and with his drug addiction getting worse, Jones increases the indoctrination and abuse of the members of his cult.
So then I started writing letters and taking them to the post office and advising my family members of things that were going on.
But 2 weeks pass until Yolanda Williams hears from her family.
I'm sitting out on the veranda of the house, and a little cab pulls up. And this cab driver gets out, and he says, "Is this the place where there's some United States citizens?" And I looked at him and I said, "Why? Who wants to know?" Out of the cab comes my mother. And when I ran in my mother's arms, all I could say is, "Don't give him your passport, don't give him your cash, don't give him your passport, don't give him your cash. Please, 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 promise me you won't. She's like, "Girl, shut up, I'm not giving them my stuff." I said, "Just please, please, mother, we gotta get out of here, we gotta go."
Concerned relatives were the family members of people back in California who started to suspect when they didn't hear from their relatives in Jonestown, or when they received letters that were very stiff and seemed almost dictated.
In May 1978, Debbie Blakey, one of the PR girls in Georgetown, changes the course of events.
At one point, she is back in Jonestown visiting her mother, and she hears Jim Jones talking about revolutionary suicide, and she gets really scared, and then decides to go to the U.S. Embassy in Georgetown and tell them what's going on. They help her get back to California, where she has a press conference and tells the world. The Chronicle runs this saying Jim Jones is planning to kill everyone in Jonestown. What happens after that is that the concerned relatives get very frightened. They ask Congressman Ryan to go down to Jonestown and see if their relatives are okay.
That was on November 17th. And then the siren goes off and we run to the pavilion. And then we realize that those are the concerned relatives and Congressman Ryan, and he's gonna be there that night. So Diane says to me, "We're leaving tonight." I said, "Okay."
They had a show, dancing, singing, a special meal for them, an orchestrated event, and we were trained and rehearsed on what we were supposed to say, all the same answers, which, if you think about it, if you're interviewing a whole bunch of people and everybody says exactly the same thing, it would be a bit suspicious, don't you think? But that's what we did.
And Congressman Ryan addresses the crowd and he says, "It looks like you all are happy here. Everyone I've talked to has said the same thing. You don't want to come back. You enjoy it here." And there is a round of deafening applause.
Congressman Ryan's impression can't be further from the truth. but only one member of the crowd dares to make a move in a very discreet way.
Don Harris, one of the reporters, had been circling around the circle, and I had slipped him a note, help us get out of Jonestown. And so then he dropped it, little kid saw it, I picked it up, I said, oh, you dropped something.
So Diane said, we're not going to go tonight because Vern passed the note. So everyone's watching.
Group decides to leave the following morning.
So we started walking up the hill, and I was waiting for the bullet because I thought there's no way they can't see us from below. There's no way they can't see us. And I'm carrying Jakari. I'm on the tail, on the left. And we keep walking. And so by the time we started getting deeper into the jungle, into the bush, we could hear the guards at the guard shack. We were that close, we could hear their voices.
But Jim Jones and his guards have other concerns on their minds.
In the middle of an interview between Don Harris and Jim Jones, he pulls out this note from Vernon Gosney and he hands it to him and he says, well, what do you make of this? And then Jim Jones, you can see his face fall.
People play games, friend. They lie. What can I do about liars? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us. Bill, we will bother nobody. Anybody wants to get out of here can get out of here. We have no problem about getting out of here. They come and go all the time. I don't know what kind of game. People like publicity. Some people do. I don't.
Congressman Ryan was in the pavilion talking to more people that wanted to leave because the momentum was growing. People were getting more courage about wanting to leave. There were people coming that wanted to get into the truck, and we had to get out of there because our Congressman Ryan's life was in danger. Someone came and tried to cut his throat. So we all loaded up into the dump truck. The dump truck was allegedly stuck in the mud until Congressman Ryan came running out of the pavilion with some blood on his shirt.
The dump trucks managed to get to the Port Kaituma airstrip, where Congressman Ryan's entourage and 15 defectors board the two small planes. Vernon Gosney climbs into a small 6-seat Cessna next to a defector named Larry Layton.
We went taxiing down the runway to take off, and as the plane was getting ready to take off, a tractor trailer pulled out in front of us and cut us off, and the plane went off to the side. And at that time, I heard the shooting.
The same People's Temple security guards who had escorted the trucks to the airstrip opened fire, killing 5 people, including Don Harris and Leo Ryan. He becomes history's only U.S. congressman to be killed in the line of duty.
To Larry, who was sitting next to me, and said, they're killing everyone, they're killing everyone. And then he pulled out the gun and he shot me once on each side.
Although badly wounded, Vernon Gosney and the other passengers managed to subdue Larry Layton.
At this time, their adrenaline is running. I have no pain, I have nothing, I'm in a total altered state, everything is in slow motion, and I'm just surviving. So I get out of the plane and I run to the jungle. I remember looking and seeing all the blood and I thought, oh, I'm gonna die. And then I blacked out.
We walked for hours and hours. So finally it's dark and we're still on the road and we're hearing this train come back. And this time Richard says, we're gonna get on the train if it stops and we're gonna find somebody to take us to a payphone so we can call the U.S. Embassy. And that's what happened.
These henchmen roll back into Jonestown, and Jim Jones calls everyone to the pavilion and says, this is it. If one of us goes down, we're all gonna go down. So suddenly this is the moment that they have been training for, the moment of revolutionary suicide.
This is a revolutionary suicide. This is not a self-destructive suicide. So they'll pay for this. They brought this upon us. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace.
I can imagine many of them were hoping that it was just another drill. So when their children then, who were given the cyanide first started going into convulsions and frothing at the mouth because it's horrible death, they realized that this was the real thing.
Don't be this way. Stop this hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialists and communists to die. No way for us to die. We must die with some dignity.
You can hear them crying, you can hear them shouting no. You can hear them dying, you know. Sorry.
Still, some of the people confront Jones, trying desperately to move him off his decision.
I will never believe to this day that 900 people just willingly stood there in line and waited for their dosage of poison. And it's not a believable scenario.
Forensics experts who are dispatched to Jonestown find bodies that had been jabbed in the back with poison needles, suggesting that they refused to follow Jones' orders. They weren't given an alternative to death. Survival was never an option.
It was murder. It wasn't suicide. These people had no choice that night. It was death by guns, the guns that were now trained on them by Jim Jones's henchmen, or it was death by poison, which they thought would be an easier way to die. And they didn't drink the poison. It was forced down their throats by a madman who destroyed the most beautiful ideals we have as humans.
Families who had been forced to live separately for so many months could die together.
Now, Jim Jones, after watching this horrible death, witnessing it, he took the coward's way out and he shot himself.
Still, Jim Jones could not have pulled off this massacre on his own. His inner circle took part in the months of planning. The mastermind of this final solution was the young community doctor, Larry Schacht.
Because that's what Jim Jones told this small inner circle to do. Figure out how to kill everyone in Jonestown. We don't have enough bullets, so be creative. And while he was researching that option, he came across this medical journal where there was an article about saving a boy who had overdosed on cyanide.
What happened to them could have happened to any one of us. No one was exempt from it, because ultimately the leader of People's Temple had a gift. I call it now the gift to gab, but he could be whatever you needed him to be at the time. He was a Jekyll Hyde.
No one was dragged to Jonestown. They went voluntarily, regardless of the circumstances. Some were forced to go because they had nothing else left, but others, I'm not sure. So I had to forgive him, and that was the only way I could forgive myself.
People should remember about the people in Jonestown that they were a beautiful mosaic of people that for a brief time weaved together in a dream for a better world.
I live for the 900 people that can't be here to tell you what it was truly like. But in the end, as long as we're able to talk about it, they live.